Welcome to the presentation of Awesome Landscape's Work Health and Safety Report. The purpose of this report is to ensure an effective health and safety management system is in place at Awesome Landscapes. The report provides information that will assist Awesome Landscapes in adhering to work health and safety legislation, national standards, and also facilitate the continual improvement of work health and safety standards within the workplace. Several gaps were identified through a hazard inspection and through assessing risk in the workplace. We'll go through those later in the presentation. So what I'd like to go through first of all is the purpose of this report and hence the presentation. The presentation will give you an overview of the contents of the report. And firstly, it is to ensure, as mentioned, that there is an effective health and safety management system in place. We'll look at how there are various components to this report. The first thing we looked at I'll go into is the findings. Second thing is discussion points and recommendations and a conclusion. So this will be the basis of the presentation today. So again, it's paramount that there is an effective work health and safety management system in place. And we've identified some gaps between what exists currently at Awesome Landscapes and what should actually exist when compared to legislation and standards. The process that was taken was, first of all, there was a site inspection, then hazards were identified, a risk assessment was undertaken, and then an implementation and monitoring plan was put in place. And finally, recommendations were made on how to improve the work health and safety at Awesome Landscapes. So, first of all, looking at the findings, some of the issues identified was, first of all, the work health and safety policies and procedures as they stand currently are inadequate. These need to be modified and supplemented with more information and more processes, because as it stands, they just do not provide enough information. Secondly, there seems to be recurring hazards, which means that the hazards are not being addressed, and so they're continually coming up. And whilst it might be a minor incident now, eventually it could lead into quite a dramatic work health and safety issue. But once an incident is identified or a hazard is identified, they should be addressed and they shouldn't recur. And one of the other findings is that the implementation and monitoring procedures are inadequate, which means that once the process is put in place, the consultation plan has been had and the risk assessment has been made and remedies have been sought, they're not being implemented. If they are being implemented, they're not being monitored to make sure that they don't recur again. And the other finding was that the policies and procedures do not identify the employer obligations to the employee. It identifies employee obligations, but it doesn't outline the responsibilities of the employer. So, one of the areas we looked at was the research analysis. This presentation will cover 3 of those areas. But first of all, we'll just look at the principles of work health and safety, and in particular, occupational health and safety in Victoria. So employees and other persons at work and members of the public must be given the highest level of protection against risk to their health and safety. Quite simply, this means that employees at a workplace must be protected and to ensure that they come to work and that they have a health and safe environment within which to operate. And employers are responsible for eliminating or reducing those risks so far as reasonably practicable. So one of the first examples that we've identified was the fire extinguisher and fire alarm were inaccessible in the kitchen area. The consequence here is what's going to happen if you can't access the fire extinguisher and fire alarm. Well, clearly, if there's a fire, there's going to be a problem. So employers are responsible for ensuring the safety of everyone in the workplace, especially during emergencies such as fires. Fire equipment should be placed where it can be accessed quickly, and a fire extinguisher should be regularly maintained. And this is the standard to which you would refer on how to maintain the fire extinguishers. And compliance with Australian standards should conform to the building layout and the fire risks that are determined, and it's management's responsibility to ensure that these standards are adhered to. So fire equipment should be placed where it can be accessed quickly if needed. This includes a fire extinguisher, a hose and a blanket. If unsure, the local fire authority or fire equipment supplier can be contacted for advice. Fire equipment should also be tested by the local fire authority or fire equipment supplier to ensure it operates correctly. There are several classes of extinguishers that are designed to be used for specific types of fires, and therefore there are specific types of extinguishers for grease or cooking fires that should be located near a kitchen area. The type of mount used should be appropriate to the area it's located. Some options might be wall mounts and solutions for those areas susceptible to higher traffic. Distance from the risk area should be 15 metres maximum, according to the Australian standards, and the signs that direct people to the location of a fire extinguisher must be easily visible down a corridor. The sign should be placed directly above the device and specify the type of fires the extinguisher is used for and an arrow pointing to the extinguisher. The location of installing a fire extinguisher should be determined by a trained professional that can access the fire risks and then recommend the location for the installation. And criteria that are considered when accessing include the extinguisher should be located in a conspicuous and readily available position. Appropriate signage indicated extinguisher locations. The extinguisher is mounted at the appropriate height. This is 100 millimetres between the floor and base of the unit and 1200 metres between floor and top of the unit. The extinguisher or its location sign must be fully visible from 20 metres in all directions of its approach. And areas surrounding the fire extinguisher must be clear from obstructions. And if you go back to our original hazard, that it was not accessible at all. So these are the areas that we've covered. The research analysis example 1, visible signage, location of extinguisher. So how to control the hazard? They should be located in a conspicuous and readily accessible position as discussed, appropriate signage, mounted at the appropriate height, and that it is visible from 20 metres in all directions and clear of obstructions, and also have the appropriate fittings and brackets attached to it. And overall, it must comply with the Building Regulations Act of 2006 and the Building Code of Australia. So what needs to be done here to rectify the current situation is a revised evacuation procedure, an emergency response procedure for specific emergencies such as fires in the kitchen. The procedure as it currently stands requires additional information and protocols for employees to follow, so the information as it stands is not sufficient. So the objective here is to provide sufficient fire safety equipment within the workplace, including correctly fitted equipment to ensure the ongoing health and safety of employees, contractors and visitors to the premises. The premises will be equipped with appropriate firefighting equipment and fire detectors and alarms. Fire extinguishers should be most suited to its environment. So a kitchen fire extinguisher may be different to a fire extinguisher you may have in an office area. And also, training of staff should be provided to give them the skills necessary to use the extinguisher should it be required. And also notifying them of where the extinguishers are located. And this can be done on a map or walking employees around the workplace. So employees should be trained in how to use the fire equipment, what types of fire extinguishers you use for different types of fires, and they should be able to follow the displayed operating instructions. And finally, the extinguishers need to be regularly inspected, and the inspection will then put a label, the inspector will put a label on it to say when it was last serviced, so you know when to resurface. The training provider for this is Fire and Safety Australia. So, the second example, the fire alarm wasn't accessible. This is our second hazard. And the consequence of this is there is an inability to alert employees to a fire, which is clearly potentially very dangerous. The requirements here are the employers are responsible for ensuring the safety of everyone, especially during emergencies. So fire equipment should be placed where it can be accessed, a written emergency evacuation plan made. The emergency evacuation plan diagram should be clearly visible and understood. So there's going to require additional installation of signage. And again, ensuring the fire equipment is tested. Okay, how to control the hazard. Ensure the fire alarm is accessible and provide relevant training. Policies and procedures. Once again, as the policies and procedures stand currently, they are insufficient. So the recommendation is for an on-site evacuation procedure and emergency response procedure be developed. And the objective here is to provide the employees or visitors with a prompt warning if a fire occurs. So the training involved here, the employees should be trained in evacuation procedures should an alarm sound. So this may be every 6 months that an evacuation example is given, so where all employees know where to gather. Training as mentioned, should occur every 6 months, and when new staff are hired, they should be made aware of the evacuation procedures and anything in relation to fire risks. So, all fire alarm systems must be working and in order, including the emergency light working. Any records of faults in the system must be maintained. All escape routes must be clearly marked in both signage and within the area. All escape routes must be kept clear. All fire escapes must be able to be opened easily, and fire exit signs must be in the right place. And this is all part of the employee training, so this is what the employees will learn. And a training provider for this is CFA Victoria, Industrial, Commercial and Residential Training in Evacuation Preparedness. Okay, example 3. Chemicals are not clearly labelled. The consequence here is there's adverse effects on employee health. And the requirement here is that hazardous chemicals must be labelled correctly so as workers using them know the hazards. So health hazards such as skin irritations or respiratory issues can have an adverse effect on workers' health as a result of direct contact with or exposure to chemicals through inhalation, skin contact or ingestion. So Work Health and Safety Part 3 Division 2 says that the management must ensure that the workplace is essentially safe and without risks to health, and it is an offence not to provide a safe work environment. So how do we rectify the current situation? Well, essentially, hazardous chemicals must be clearly and correctly labelled so the workers using them know what they're using and the potential hazards involved. There's such a thing called a GHS label that is required for any hazardous chemical intended for use in the workplace. And the following steps should be implemented to ensure the chemicals that aren't clearly labelled now are. So first of all, the chemicals need a product identifier. They need the name, the Australian address and business telephone number of the manufacturer or importer on the label. The label should also contain the proportion of ingredients and any hazard pictogram consistent with the correct classification of the chemical. And it should also contain a hazard statement, a signal word and precautionary statement consistent with the correct classification of the chemical. It should have any information about the hazards, first aid and emergency procedures relevant to the chemical, which are not included in the hazard statement or precautionary statement. An expiry date, if relevant, and the label may include an emergency phone number for specific poisons or treatment advice. The label should be clearly legible and firmly fixed to the container. It shouldn't be obscured or in a spot where it could be removed, for example on a lid. So the policies and procedures. Policies and procedures need to be developed to address the emergency response procedures, internal emission spill and Section 35 waste management. These policies alone, as it stands, do not adequately address the listing of contents of chemicals or what the items have inside them. So the recommendation here is to clearly label any hazardous chemicals and identify hazards by providing instructions on how to use them safely. This will assist Awesome Landscapes to identify and implement safe controls needed and tell workers how to deal with these chemicals safely. So the training will involve the use and handling of hazardous substances and their potential to cause skin disease, poisoning or respiratory illnesses if they're not used properly. A training provider here is WorkSafe Victoria under their hazardous substance guide. And this will just explain who the provider here. This is just a guide that employers can use and can train from that guide. So they're the three main hazards we identified. There were several hazards that were identified, and some of these others were front entrance sign on the pillar was in a dangerous location, scraps of food on the bench top, shelving blocking access to hallways, wet stains over the television in the boardroom, shelving blocking the fire hydrant, exit near the boardroom obstructed with the chair, fire extinguisher not easily accessible, chemicals being stored with chemicals that they shouldn't be stored with, chemicals not clearly labelled, box of tissues left next to the stove, trolley blocking the doorway, no covers on the cooktop stove. So here we have an example of a hazard identification form, and so going forward, if you identify any hazards, this form needs to be completed. Here you'll identify the hazard, you'll outline any risks associated with the hazard, identify who or what is at risk, who in the workplace is at risk, or what is at risk. Is it the office environment? Is it a computer system? Specifically, what is it at risk? And possible actions to reduce that risk. And this is for every single hazard identified, and this is the process you'll go through. So to run you through the process of how the hazards were identified, first of all, I interviewed all relevant stakeholders in the workplace. So that was management, employees, to briefly run through the consultation process of how these hazards were identified. All relevant stakeholders in the workplace were consulted. That includes all employees and management. That way, everybody had an opportunity to contribute to the work health and safety within Awesome Landscapes. And by involving the stakeholders in the process of assessing the risk is paramount, so that they have a good because they have the best understanding of the workplace in which they work and also the risks involved. In addition, the employees who are at risk in performing their work functions can have input into the safety, increased safety within their environment. And it also motivates employees and encourages them to continuously improve the health and safety of the workplace. And this two-way communication process between employees and management encourages an open, positive work culture whereby all employees and feedback of opinions is valued. Okay, so the risk rating matrix. So once the hazards are identified, we then look at the risk rating matrix. So how the risk rating matrix works is you identify whether the hazard is insignificant, minor, moderate, major or severe. And as you'll see, it's got a corresponding number to it. And then down the left-hand side, we look at whether it's almost certain to occur, likely to occur, moderate, unlikely, or rare. So for example, if we have a risk that is insignificant and it's unlikely to occur, then it would be considered low. This area here obviously very high, and this area very high and high we want to avoid. So using the three examples that we had before, the exit near the boardroom was obstructed with a chair. So this was given an initial risk rating of 1 being insignificant. So if we look at the risk rating matrix and apply it to the three examples that we used before, the exit near the boardroom was obstructed with a chair. So the initial priority level we assigned to it was a 2. So if we go back to the risk rating matrix, a 2 is considered quite high because it's almost certain to occur. So we want to change that priority level. We want to make it a higher revised risk rating. Therefore, what we're going to do, the control we're going to put in place here, is to remove the chair from the doorway to a storage area or the desk. Then that brings our risk rating from a 2 of high back down to a 4, which is low. Quite a simple control measure, but clearly very effective. Here the fire extinguisher, not easily accessed, initially was very high, a 1, priority level 1, which is the highest priority level. By removing the chair from the front of the fire extinguisher and storing the chair in the warehouse, we've moved it from a priority level 1 to a low priority level of 4. The aerosol can and chemicals that were stored in the same cupboard was a priority level 2, but by naming those chemicals and storing them in appropriate locations, we've managed to bring the priority level down to a 4. And again, with the hazards identified before, these are the control measures for all of the other hazards identified, and I'll let you go through those at a later point. But they're very simple, easy control measures, like clearing doorways, moving things into different areas, storing things in appropriate locations. So it's paramount that there is an implementation plan. It's no use identifying hazards and assigning them a risk rating and then just leaving it there. They must be implemented and they must be monitored. So the implementation plan involves developing a plan and a schedule for the work to be carried out. This means assigning people to a particular hazard and ensuring that it is eliminated or greatly reduced, as well as assigning a time that it's going to be rectified by. Assign responsibilities to people, assign dates, and review the progress. That's part of the monitoring plan. And provide feedback to the staff. Let them know where it's at. And this is the form you'll use for the implementation plan. Again, hazard description, the action required to implement the controls, who the person is responsible, when it's going to be completed, when it actually was completed, and what monitoring plans are in place so that it doesn't happen again. Will they be quarterly inspections? Will they be weekly walkarounds? Will they be consultations and meetings with management? These are all part of the monitoring plan. So to go through the legislation and standards very briefly, that you'll forever be referring to make sure that the workplace adheres to all legislative and legal requirements. The Australian Standard for Fire Detection, Australian Standard Fire Hydrant Installation, the Australian Standard for Portable Fire Extinguishers, Australian Standard Routine Service of Fire Protection Systems and Equipment, Building Regulations, Building Code, the Building Act of 1993, the Code of Practice, Emergency Management Victoria, Occupational Health and Safety Regulations, and WorkSafe Victoria. So the legislation and standards that were referred to throughout the analysis and the presentation are all listed here. It includes the Occupational Health and Safety Act of Victoria 2004, plus various standards with relation to fire extinguishers and fire codes, building regulations, codes of practice, as well as regulations. And those legislation and standards you should continually be referring to make sure that your work health, that your work environment is always up to date and current with the latest legislation. So to conclude, I just want to start by saying the culture within the workplace is really important to ensuring that effective work health and safety management systems are in place. If management communicate a message of creating a safe workforce, the culture will shift to one where employees at all levels of the organisation, through their actions and their beliefs and values, if it's displayed through management, collectively there will be a more cooperative work health and safety environment. And it can be, it's simply achieved through involving employees at all levels of the organisation and asking them what they believe requires changing. Employing qualified health and safety professionals to be involved in assessments, creating a plan to address the pitfalls in the current policies, making the amended policies available to all employees, and invest in the employees through training. And this is all done through a consultative process. That way they have ownership of it, they have input to it, and they feel a part of working towards a healthy work environment. So recommendations for further improvement would be regularly walking around the work office area for management, talking regularly with employees, conducting surveys of workers. Do they feel that the workplace is currently safe? Have they identified any opportunities where it could be safer? Enhancing the current policies and procedures, resolving the outstanding work health and safety issues as we've identified, and monitoring the workers' health and workplace conditions continually, and providing information and training. So to become compliant with legislation, some of the recommendations are more detailed documentation, for example, within incident reporting, regular communication with employees about incident reporting and the importance of work health and safety in the workplace, training on equipment in hazard reporting, effective work health and safety within the workplace, clearly assigning responsibilities of employees within the organisation, including monitoring work health and safety systems at all levels, measuring and evaluating outcomes through audits and reviews, incident data reports, registers and records, and more involvement from management. And training should be targeted towards the areas of most frequently occurring workplace injuries. So this all addresses the importance of an effective and healthy, safe management system. We went through the hazards identified, and again, a lot of these have been repeated and they're really, really easy to control. So really easy control measures. And the implementation and monitoring is paramount. As mentioned, there's no use having identifying hazards and assigning risks, a risk rating to them without making sure that it's being implemented, and more importantly, that it's continually being monitored so that it doesn't occur again. Communication with employees, two-way communication between employees and management. And we'll now open the floor up to if there are any questions.
Who is responsible for eliminating or reducing risks in the workplace?
So one of the audience members has asked who is responsible for eliminating the risks in the workplace. The answer to that is everybody is responsible. It's management's primary responsibility to make sure that they are eliminated. However, employees are also responsible for identifying them and making management aware of them. It is a team effort and everybody should be involved.
Where can this information be accessed?
Okay, the other question we've been asked is how can these be accessed? There is a central system where all the policies and procedures will be placed. All the necessary forms are on there, and it will be in a folder in Work Health and Safety, and your immediate supervisors will tell you where this information can be accessed. It's readily available and everybody can access it.
Should someone be notified if a hazard is identified, even if no one is injured? If yes, who?
Okay, one other question was, should somebody be notified if a hazard has been identified and it hasn't caused serious injury? The answer to that is yes. All hazards should be noted, documented, and a control plan should be put in place, because whilst it might not cause an injury now, perhaps in the future it could. And the whole point of having an effective work health and safety system is to eliminate all work health and safety issues. So yes, they should be. Okay, thanks everybody for coming today. If there are any questions, please refer to the online information as well as your management. And again, work health and safety is everybody's priority. It's not just management, and I encourage a two-way communication of identifying hazards and ensuring that you have a safe work health environment.